Wendy and I actually put down our credit cards for $5,000 each and donated menstrual cups. That's how this thing kicked off. First of all, you think about menstruation, it affects half the planet and indirectly the other half. Mm-hmm. No one was funding it. And if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, menstruation ends up being a catalytic funding opportunity that sort of hits the first half of the goals.
We know that some markets are not small, but they've been unfundable. Not because the demand was weak, but because taboo made them harder to study, harder to regulate, and therefore easy for capital to ignore.
I think we were actually a little bit naive when we started off. We thought, oh, how hard could it be?
Yes.
Yeah, there's new product, and we'll solve the issue.
Yeah.
Huge mistake.
That's
learning opportunity.
Menstruation is not a product issue.
No, it's not a product issue.
Wow. This is Cristina Ljungberg and Wendy Anderson, co-founders of The Case for Her. And this episode is about catalytic capital, the kind that doesn't just invest in markets, it creates them. This is Blindspot Capital. Let's talk about how markets are created. There is a quiet assumption in investing that markets are efficient, that if a market is real, capital will find it. But that's not how the women's health market has worked historically. And we know that some markets are not small, but they've been unfundable. Not because the demand was weak, but because taboo made them harder to study, harder to regulate, and therefore easy for capital to ignore. Areas like in reproductive health, like menstruation, female sexual wellness, or access to medication abortion. Today's conversation is about what happens before venture capital shows up, before benchmarks, before term sheets or permission. My guests today are Cristina Ljungberg and Wendy Anderson, co-founders of The Case for Her, a catalytic capital platform that uses philanthropy, impact, and early risk capital to open up markets in women's health that have long remained closed. And instead of asking whether these markets were investable, Wendy and Cristina asked a different question. They asked, what would it take for capital to even see them? Today's episode isn't about philanthropy versus venture. It's about the role of catalytic capital in creating markets and what that means for investors paying attention. Cristina, Wendy, it's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So this podcast, we talk a lot about capital, we talk about systems, about markets, but those decisions always come from people first. So I think before we go any further, if someone is tuning into this podcast for the first time and has never heard of Cristina or Wendy, who are you before the work? Not what you do, but who you are.
Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Cristina Ljungberg. I'm American. I've been living in Sweden for about 25 years. My background's biology, biotechnology. I really worked in the healthcare sector before changing it up a bit. And I've just been passionate about women's health for a long time. And in my 30s, it became obvious that I wanted to do something where I could have the most impact, which brought me to this work and to this amazing partner. Yeah, I don't know. We'll just start with that. So much is going to come out as we talk about the case for her.
I'm Wendy Anderson. I'm a Canadian. Ended up in Sweden because I used to work on in financial services. So I was part of a team building trading engines for very large stock exchanges around the world. And my background actually I was an English major out of university, but I started working at the Toronto Stock Exchange early on and just built a love for that environment. Ended up here in Sweden, married a Swede, and then moved basically into philanthropic giving about 25 years ago.
Wow. So you've both talked about, your background in terms of impact and philanthropy. And as I mentioned earlier, The Case for Her is a catalytic capital platform, and you use different instruments, from philanthropy through to investments and debt. Take me back to the moment that kind of sparked it for you, sort of that aha moment when you said, okay, you know what, this is something that I can't unsee. What kind of brought you together to co-found The Case for Her, I think 15 years ago?
So about 15 years ago is when my husband and I, our family, decided to kick off having a family foundation, which was called Giving Wings, which you will never actually hear that name, although it really stands behind The Case for Her. along with Wendy's foundation. And that journey was really difficult. Philanthropy was quite stigmatized, or remains quite stigmatized in the Nordics. So we decided women and girls education, healthcare was a good place to start. It wasn't the wrong place, but really it set us off on this journey asking questions, what are the greatest inequities facing our planet today, and which ones are ripe for change? And as budding philanthropists, it would have made absolutely no sense to throw our relatively small amount of capital into a black hole where most of the capital was flowing. Around that same time, Wendy and I had the pleasure to meet each other, and we were in similar positions with foundations trying to figure it out. And one of the things that popped up when we were discussing what is massively underfunded and has an opportunity for change, menstruation, of course, came up first. Because if you think about it, you think about this, well, first of all, you think about menstruation, it affects half the planet and indirectly the other half. No one was funding it. And if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, menstruation ends up being a catalytic funding opportunity that sort of hits the first half of the goals. So poverty alleviation, water and sanitation, health, education, gender equality. So that started us. Did you want to add something?
No, it's pretty much it. Like, my husband, he and his family had a foundation a bit longer than Cristina and Johan's, and we were funding development of schools. So we built a lot of schools in various parts in Africa, and he had come back from a visit to some of those schools, and we're just asking some questions about, okay, what would have been better? We built the schools, we built the classrooms with a focus on getting girls into the classrooms. This was 15, 20 years ago. He's like, but there's a piece there missing because the girls aren't showing up, or the girls are showing up and then leaving again. So what are we doing wrong? So we started having this debate between us about what are some of these foundational items that we've simply overlooked, and it wouldn't be a good idea to start addressing those. And that's where this idea of menstruation suddenly hit us. Honestly, it was floated by us with a opportunity to fund a study. And I just sat there kind of dumbfounded thinking, I'd never actually considered it. I'd been lucky enough to be able to manage my menstruation. I've been sitting around tables without even ever thinking about it, never wondered what anybody else was doing it. And of course it could be impactful. So luckily that's when Cristina walked through the door and we started this conversation. And we really just started with really small amounts of money coming out of our own individual foundations. And it took us a while before we realized that when we brought in our third co-founder, that we could create an organization and take a bigger seat at the table if we became the case for her.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to back up. I think this forum, it's really nice to be like super honest about like what it takes to get started. Wendy and I actually put down our credit cards for $5,000 each and donated menstrual cups. That's how this thing kicked off. And we kicked off where we started a learning journey. We started a learning journey trying to really understand the different aspects of menstruation, which is quite complex when you start to think about this ecosystem.
I think we were actually a little bit naive when we started off. We thought, how hard could it be?
Yes.
Yeah, there's the product and we'll solve the issue.
Yeah.
Huge mistake.
That's
learning opportunity.
Menstruation is not a product issue.
No, it's not a product issue.
Wow.
So that kicked off this learning journey. And, as we moved forward, the work just got more and more fascinating and interesting and dynamic. And I think, today we're really talking about money and capital and how to de-risk the space. So just a little bit about that. How do two philanthropy first individuals end up being some of the most significant investors and funders in femtech today?
Yes.
Well, we actually were raised a bit by Acumen, the global impact investment organization that from day one, when we started working and funding them, taught us that capital, of course, can move in all the different ways, not just philanthropy, but impact investors, there are social enterprises. And having Acumen be sort of the backbone of our journey has led us here, where today the portfolio looks like everything from debt, equity, VC, recoupable grants, working capital loans, safe notes, wise notes. We really have thought about capital as just being a tool that moves in different ways, the way that it needs to, basically to take the two of us on this learning journey, give us access, help us build credibility, and ultimately produce the evidence that's necessary to de-risk this space.
Yes. So tell me about the first decision where you actually put capital to work and thought, you know what, we're really doing this now.
Well, so at the beginning, Wendy and I did fund, as we were learning, we did fund product distribution. We funded education. We started on the journey of funding metrics, which we're still working on. But I would say the first investment that I made was into a Ugandan company called AfriPads, where, it was a relatively small investment. It was $50,000. Of course, Wendy and I could have paid for $50,000 of products to be distributed somewhere. But instead, that was part of what's been a 14-year journey ish at this point, where there's a sustainable business there manufacturing millions of pads for millions of women and girls that is part of developing what I think Wendy will talk about, which is taking a market-based approach to products in menstrual health.
Yeah. And from my side, I did a very similar journey. I invested in a company called B-Girl that produces reusable menstrual products, and they have a slightly different approach than AfriPads, but they're kind of in the same space. For me, it's been an incredible opportunity when you get in and start working very closely with a company like that. You understand what are the barriers that they're facing. That's when we really started learning, because we put together, it wasn't just, we didn't just drop the money and walk away. We were part of the journey, even from the very beginning with the distribution, the very first menstrual cup distribution. We wanted to know, okay, what happened when we did this? We continued to ask the questions. We did a really amazing study even that was called SHEOS that you can access on our website that actually had more legs than we ever imagined.
Exactly.
But it was asking the question, okay, if girls themselves got to choose what product they wanted to use, what kind of results would we get? Because when we first started, we actually, with the very first grant that we gave, we made a big assumption sitting in our comfortable chairs in Stockholm that girls are going to want menstrual cups, right? That's what we proceeded with.
Or that it was the answer to the question, how can you manage your period most effectively in a cost-effective ways?
We didn't take into consideration what the end user actually wanted, and that was a big, eye-opener for us. And so we did this study. It was a real lean study.
Fascinating.
But we had multiple parts. We used actual kiosk owners on the ground. We brought in products from 3 different sources, made sure that they were priced appropriately. So we had menstrual cups, we had reusable menstrual pads, and we had disposable pads. And then we had educational sessions in classrooms, which gave girls an understanding about menstruation, an understanding about the product choices available to them. Then they went to the kiosks, and they needed to use their own money, but they were immediately reimbursed. We used Safaricom. Echo Mobile at the time, who was tracking the data then. So an Echo Mobile would reimburse the user for having spent her own money, but that way we got data on what product was chosen, and then we could follow up afterwards about how did you experience that product, why did you choose that product, and are you still using that product? And what we discovered was really, really interesting is that when given the opportunity for choice, girls were buying, what were the data points again?
Well, so I mean, you can imagine this is our biggest failure and one of our biggest learnings. So we're sharing that here at the beginning of the podcast. I mean, we had just distributed 15,000 menstrual cups at the beginning of our journey. And when given the girls the opportunity to choose, it was actually 50-50 disposable and reusable pads. No one more or less chose the menstrual cups. And you know what? It was so insanely liberating, getting close to the issue and really digging into it and understanding it, that we could just release ourselves, because it's just about being an advocate for choice. We don't need to know the answers. And I think what's interesting maybe about this story as funders or impact funders sometimes it's important to really raise up the risk tolerance and say we're taught that you need to know the answers, but maybe the smarter idea is to not need to know the answers, but trust in the process and fail forward a bit. So I would say our first...
I don't think that was a failure.
Well, no, ultimately not. It was one of our greatest learnings, but I'm quite okay with failing forward as long as you're not doing any harm.
Any harm,
Yes.
Yeah. So the early days were really investing more in very local social enterprises, but ultimately deciding early on to focus on the most highly stigmatized key women's health areas, which, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, for us means menstruation, sexual health, taking a pleasure-based sex-positive approach, and global access to medication, abortion. You realize that these topics are stigmatized everywhere, which has led us today to be investing in all sorts of different companies in Europe, in the US, in Africa, in Asia. So that portfolio, again, was really a learning journey for us. And today it includes everything from research, product distribution, metrics, standards, innovative financing, design, all sorts of different things.
Yes. That is so interesting. I mean, the learnings that you made, which is links to a very important point about, raising the risk tolerance and stepping in even when there is, there's no market yet to actually form that market. It's a really important point about market creation, which I want to talk to you a bit more about. But you mentioned something, Cristina, when you talked about I think Wendy, you mentioned it, when you talked about the challenges that, you didn't just give capital, but you really immersed yourself operationally as well. And there you also saw the challenges the companies were dealing with. I want to talk about maybe the challenges, but maybe particularly on the taboo, where did that show up in practice operationally, as these companies, they've got some funding and they're doing the work. Where did the taboo show up culturally, but also operationally?
So it's interesting. You bump into things without even expecting them. I think if I go back to menstruation, the taboos are everywhere, right? You're talking about individuals who don't want to carry product in their kiosks or in the distribution lines. You have people who don't want to display product because it's considered to be inappropriate. Yeah. You have individuals who don't have access to capital because they can't convince the capital owners to give them capital. And this is even from the business owners down to the individual consumers who are trying to purchase the product. There's stigma regarding disposal of menstrual products and how you deal with that. So designing toilet systems that don't include space for menstruators. The bumps, and then even when you're talking about market building, we discovered one of the biggest barriers to building markets for menstrual products is that there are no global product standards, no consumer product standards globally for menstrual products. So that's another thing that we kicked off. We're now working with ISO to develop the world's first consumer product standard for menstrual products. And we have almost 60 countries now involved with that. And we've managed to bring in co-funding to really kick that off. The next piece is HS codes, which are the harmonized system codes required by products in order to understand how they're moving around the globe. They don't include menstrual products in a granularity that's useful for tracking growth. So we're working very closely. Actually, it's the Sanitation Hygiene Fund that is leading this work. And the Canadian government has actually been quite useful in hopefully stepping up to lead as well. It might be really premature to say that, but they're on the line and expressed interest in any case.
Yes.
But these are multi-year projects that are needed. And we wouldn't have even known about them if you're not working with entrepreneurs who say, or even practitioners who say, hey, I can't import your products into my country because there's no tax codes for them. And there's no tax codes because we don't have any standards. Ghana, for a long period of time, could not manufacture products in country because they didn't know to what standard they should be held. They want to make sure that the consumers are protected. But without global product standards, how do you do that? So you can either import or export product into that country for a period of time, and that's getting better. Nairobi in Kenya has been a world leader in developing product standards, but they did that together with AfriPads, who, as a major manufacturer of product in that area, was really necessary. They needed to get standards up to speed so that they could meet the market demand for their product. So this is it's a dance. And so when you're hitting stigma and taboo, you have to have these conversations all the time, because the individuals who are sitting around the tables deciding what's necessary forget about women's health. They forget about menstruation. It's not something that they consider. And I don't think it's because of a lack of will. It's just that it's been consistently overlooked.
So when you look back over your journey, it sounds to me like, listening to you, it's not sort of one specific thing that has unlocked movement. Over the last 15 years, you've been working on the case for her. It's a combination of, say, research, product standards, regulation, evidence. Is this why you would think that women's health needs catalytic capital?
Yes, I think the thing is that we're just a tiny piece of a massive ecosystem that's all working collectively. Like, there are scaffolding organizations out there, like Wash United, who run the Global Secretariat for Menstrual Hygiene Day, for example. They do an incredible amount of work to raise awareness. And we work collectively. So catalytic capital is absolutely required, and not just in terms of investable capital into businesses, but the structural capital is required to change norms, to build awareness, to change educational systems. How many educational systems are actually including menstruation or female health in their programs prior to puberty, or even like you typically added in as sexual health ed much later on, where you maybe already are sexually active. So like, we have a massive shift that has to go towards accepting of the female body in society. And so the opportunity for capital is tremendous. Like, if you think that if you're an investor who's interested in educational systems, there's an opening for you right there on how do you improve education that includes information about the female body, whether it's menstruation to menopause or post-menopause. If you're an individual who's interested in product manufacture, of course, there's space for you there. If you're interested in disposal systems, waste management, there's space for you there. Like, there is space everywhere.
Well, and you're just talking about menstrual health.
I mean, we're not even talking about reproductive health in general and the opportunities.
Or women's health.
Women's health,
I mean, I think catalytic capital is very important, but it's also key that we understand we also need advocacy and research, right? We want products and services that are based on real research. And I think this is one of the huge issues today. So there's just a massive research gap. So there's a lot of interest, but we also need that, we could call it catalytic capital, investment capital, going into the research space alongside.
Do you remember the moment in your journey when traditional investors started showing up? So not philanthropists, not grants, but traditional investors started showing up. What had changed by then?
Probably the last 5 years with the VCs.
Well, I mean, I think we started seeing more traditional capital around the time that Clue was founded.
Probably.
More or less. How many years ago has that been?
That was 10 years.
I mean, that was such a unique opportunity at the time. And today the space is getting a bit crowded. So what has changed? I mean, honestly, I think it does have to do with data, evidence, research, and advocacy that's really gotten louder and louder over these last few years. Of course, we can all name some of the data that's come up the last couple of years about the $1 trillion opportunity, the gap.
I think that some kind of advocacy has helped to professionalize the space and bring it into boardrooms where it wasn't available before. You can be a rampant advocate and talk about menstrual health around a dinner table, but it's when you get the backing of the large organizations that it's the kind of like the stamp of due diligence that comes in that starts people understanding this isn't a risky space. This is a underfinanced space, and that they can enter it comfortably and capably, making a difference at the same time, but also a return. I was really, really pleased just last year with Gates Foundation's announcement, where they put, how many billion into women's health, with earmarking $400 million to gynecological and menstrual health research.
Yes.
And that has really been extraordinarily valuable in, I guess, I call it de-risking, but putting the stamp of confidence into the space that future opportunities will be based on scientific research.
Yes.
I don't think anybody listening to this podcast would be surprised to hear again that it's less than 2% of venture capital funding that goes into female-founded businesses, which still just blows my mind every time. And so when thinking about the women's health space, we understand that the majority of the women's health and femtech companies, of course, are founded by women. So one of the things that Wendy and I have also recognized is that we're not going to get the kind of capital into that space if we're not changing that capital allocation system. So, of course, women will identify those opportunities and they will invest in other women. We see that in the data. And that's when we started actually moving more of our investment portfolio through first-time and emerging female fund managers. And what we've seen that way is that we've been able to get exposure to over 100 femtech companies by actually writing large checks so that other women can write large checks. And I think that it's going to take a few more years. You know, we're not there yet. I don't think there are huge amounts of capital flowing into the women's health space, but I am optimistic as these other areas are getting up to speed, again, like the research and a shift of capital allocators. It's going to be important.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, talking about that statistic, the less than 2% of VC capital, one of the things I want to talk to you about is obviously the difficulties as a founder who's building in, say, menstrual health or even menopause or sexual wellness. I have heard from, some of the companies that I back how difficult it is to talk about the sort of the female anatomy. Sometimes you get into a pitch and you spend the first half an hour just explaining the female anatomy. And so there is a lack of knowledge, if you like, from that perspective. But there's also the discomfort in talking about, aspects of the female anatomy. Whereas if you are, if we take erectile dysfunction, it's $1 billion business. But you take a topic like, say, menopause, for example, which affects half of the population if they live long enough to a certain age, but we haven't seen as much traction or let alone research in that. So the question from my standpoint as investors in this space, what advice would you give to founders who are fundraising for a company that is working on, say, female sexual wellness or menstrual health?
Well, first, let's just acknowledge that it's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, Wendy and I aren't going to be able to come up with some brilliant insight on this. It's almost impossible to raise that capital, which sort of explains why we see most of the deal flow. There aren't that many investors that.
But I think there are companies. There are organizations. 2X Global.
Yes.
Has great research, great backing about why investment in these, female health companies and female-founded companies are safe investments and are good investments to pursue. Perhaps it would be useful to try to back some of your argument using the data and statistics that they have available. Throw in, yes, I'm a female founder, but did you know that investments in female founders are more likely to reach the goals that we explain? Like you can spin the data in a way. I'm just making a suggestion. I don't know if it would be effective, but it'd be interesting to see a pitch that included that, calling out from the very beginning that these are some of the barriers which I suspect are in your head. How about let's combat these right on with the evidence that are available from the organizations that are working in this space.
Yes.
but it is not easy, and it requires, we do need men around the table.
Yes.
Right? It can't just be women talking to women. It needs to be a societal conversation. How do we make society better for everybody? We include all of its citizens.
Yes.
And so it also starts by finding those aligned investors who are willing to start from that perspective. And there are not a lot of them out there, but they are showing up and they are existing. And they're, again, I think this is what censorship is also pointing out, is that there's not a lack of will, there's a lack of knowledge and understanding what your own barriers are internally, which are making perhaps identifying companies as having a higher risk profile.
Yes.
So perhaps just start by calling out those perceived barriers and addressing them head on. And then maybe the conversation could continue more fairly from that perspective.
What makes a company investable to you?
Oh, there's many reasons. Because we built a portfolio based on learning, sometimes it's what is it we're going to learn from that company?
Yes.
What is it they're going to add to our knowledge base so that we know what to tackle next? And other times it's just like, wow, that is one great idea, and we want to be on that when it launches. So it really depends on our perspective and where we think. Sometimes it's the network. We want to have access to a network of other investors who we know are coming on board on that particular company, because we think that then indicates they're becoming aligned investors, and we can help push them further into the femtech and the spaces as other follow-on investors. So we debate that opportunity in different ways. We're also very careful. We've learned to determine what is it that's needed in terms of capital from the company's perspective, and not just try to put our vehicle first. There are organizations that maybe even require grant capital before they're going to be ready, or they need to have some grant capital for leadership perspectives and an investment. So how do you help build something so that other people can join you?
I love that, investing to learn. I love that a lot, because I think one of the things from my side of the pond, I think one of the things that we see, which is an obstacle is too big a word, but it's that pattern recognition. As an investor, if you've not invested in a particular sector or subsector before, you don't know what you don't know, and that hesitation makes you stay away. But I think and that's why I love what you said about investing to learn, because that's how you develop the pattern recognition. You can do so much theory reading the investment pieces, but really it's the best way to get that pattern recognition is just to deploy capital.
And you invest in leaders, right?
Yes.
You're really investing in the people who are leading the companies. You get a good relationship. You have a relationship based on trust and understanding.
Yes.
And we always try to bring in other aligned investors.
Yeah, I think co-investment is super important, especially if you're starting out at the beginning. To be able to co-fund and follow along with a more experienced or senior investor is insanely useful.
Yeah.
Sharing due diligence and the rest.
Yeah. So, Cristina and Wendy, looking over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, because if I look back 5 years from today, I think we've made a big leap in terms of, just the awareness of women's health as an investable subsector of healthcare. But if we think 5 to 10 years from today, what gives you the most hope? Where do you see the biggest opportunities in women's health for capital to drive change?
I think it's kind of like I'm looking outside at snow falling, and so I'm thinking a little bit about a snowball.
Yes.
Right? Where as it rolls along, it picks up speed, it picks up size. I think we're kind of at one of those inflection points. I think that there is a realization, a growing understanding, and we're going to see, because, the femtech space, the female health space and female entrepreneurs are relatively new, right? And so we're now starting to get that evidence, again, as Christina's pointed out, that this is an investable space, and that's going to continue to grow. And as that happens, as the research starts pulling in more opportunities, more things are going to start bubbling up. So I have a real hope that we're going to see an increase in this 2% of capital going to female founders. We're going to see an increase in scientifically based opportunities in terms of hormones and others in women's health, because again, Gates Foundation is putting in billions of dollars into doing this kind of research, which benefits everybody. So I see that we're setting the seeds, or that's the core of the snowball. And it's going to pick up momentum.
Yes.
And I'm just absolutely amazed at how much we've seen the needle moves the last 15 years since we've been investing in this space. And I know that you've mentioned, and the listeners know that you spoke with Anna from Censorship. I really think the ending of digital suppression and censorship, I think we're going to see some fast change on that. And to the point that you brought up, some of it, for instance, banks and the difficulties they're accessing capital, they don't even know that there's a bias in place, right? So I think raising awareness, advocacy, and really pushing on that, using opportunities like the Digital Services Act to really shine a light on digital suppression and censorship, I think it's going to open up a lot of gateways for women's health companies, from everything, again, to accessing capital, loan capital, advertising, and communications. I think it'll make a lot more investment show up.
Yeah. We need to get more men on board, right? We need to get more aligned individuals. We can't just be speaking to ourselves all the time.
I could not agree more. Thank you so much. I think listening to this conversation, I think, what I take away or what stays with me is that markets rarely fail because the demand isn't there, particularly when I think about women's health. It's more often they fail because the conditions for capital never form. Cristina and Wendy, you didn't just step in you didn't step in to replace venture capital. You stepped in to make markets legible enough for other capital to follow on and to move. And I think that's really what Catalytic Capital does at its best. It creates markets. Thank you so much for building, for stepping in, where others hesitated, and really for sharing how markets actually open. Thank you so much.
Super. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And I think to our listeners, if there's one thing to carry forward, it's this. The most interesting markets don't just announce themselves. They take shape slowly. As you've heard, over the last 15 years, so much has changed. So these markets take shape slowly, often at the edges, long before capital feels comfortable showing up. And the question isn't whether more markets like this in women's health exist. The real question is whether you will recognize these markets while they're still forming. So thank you so much for listening to Blindspot Capital. Cristina and Wendy talked about the Shire study. We will link that in the show notes so that you can have a look at that study as well. I will do that because I'm fascinated to learn what was in that study. We've also talked about censorship, a study which shows the level and the sort of digital suppression that's happening right now to companies who are innovating in women's health. We will also link that in the show notes so that you can see that as well. And until next time, keep looking out for the blind spots because they will not fix themselves. Thank you.